Okay, so this is how I always start this semester with the Jewish Canadian singer and songwriter Leonard Cohen with his Zen master. And I really love what they say to each other. So the Zen master says to Leonard Cohen, "You are not Jewish Canadian singer." And Leonard Cohen says to his Zen master, "You are not a Zen monk." So this is just a great reminder of our true nature as the passenger, which is actually not represented on the map, right? Technically speaking, the personality is in the back seat, meaning the mind is in the back seat, so to speak, with the passenger, but there is an important distinction there, right? The personality is a machine. The passenger is not. And the passenger, like the personality, is at the mercy of the design. So some people in the field say things like, well, you're not really your design, which is true metaphysically at one level, but don't think that that means you have any choice but to surrender to exactly what's in your chart, right? The passenger has no volition, right? So it's important, though, to realize that we're more than the chart. It's important for our locus of identification, who we identify, to be at the deepest universal level. Why? Because that's how we're going to unlock universal compassion and acceptance into this world. You're not going to do it if you're overly hung up on your relative self, right? So this deeper level of identification, it's what opens up a universal compassion and acceptance for the other. The more relative we're defined, the more relative is our sphere of understanding and compassion, right? So with the human design experiment, we're holding a paradox. We're holding many paradoxes, right? But one such paradox is the juxtaposition of our true identity as the passenger beyond form, i.e., beyond the body, right? Beyond this relative existence, and the very specific relative self that we are in form in this particular incarnation, and to embrace the totality of all of that. Right? So we learn who we are at the deepest absolute and universal level, right? That level of identity is true for all of us. We all share that, right? And who we are at this relative, finite, ephemeral level of existence. And we're honoring both. And we're understanding more than we've ever had before through any other spiritual modality how all this works together. So why focus on the not self? I've got a bad reputation in the community with some people for being negative. So why focus on the not self? Why spend a whole semester learning about it? First off, you're going to be shocked, even if you're many years in the experiment, of how deep it goes and how practical it is to dredge this stuff up and take an honest look at it. It's important to understand the not self because, frankly, that's who shows up for a reading. And it's what people mostly relate with when they come to the experiment. If I have only 30 seconds or a minute to impress upon someone the accuracy and the power of human design, well, I'll say something about their not self. No, I'm not going to criticize them. No, I'm not judging or shaming them. I'm going to say, this is one of the dilemmas in your life. That's what's most relatable, right? You know that we're all very related with our problems, right? Very familiar with them, too wrapped up in them. It's important to fully understand the scope of the not self because many people in the experiment seem to be defending the seven-centered version of themselves with the chart. In other words, the not self has appropriated the chart for its own purposes. Now, this semester can really help you sort out the deeper, more subtle, and insidious layers of how your mind tries to protect you. And an important question here is, why and when does the mind try to protect us? Why is the not self doing what it's doing? Well, when is specifically when the mind is overwhelmed by your body chemistry, by the experience occurring in your body. That's when your mind will employ its very predictable, formulaic, not self strategies that we can easily learn to identify in the chart. And it's doing all of that for a reason. And the reason is that because there's a somatic experience you cannot currently be present with, whether that somatic experience is anxiety or existential fear or emotional overwhelm or just energetic overwhelm, the mind gets activated and tries to navigate, tries to step in the front seat and grab the wheel, tries to manipulate the situation. Why? Well, for your safety. Because the mind has no access to what you truly need, which is the alchemy of being. That's the nine-centered way. The transformative potential of truly being with what is presently arising, both within yourself and in your environment. So there are schools of thought in the human design field that encourage analysts to just quickly gloss over the not self in fears that going into it too much is somehow adversely affecting the client. Well, my experience is generally the opposite, but it also, there's such a thing as user error here, right? There are exceptions. Some people are very caught up in framing the not self from the lens of their inner critic. And that means framing your non self behavior with shame and judgment and guilt and some sort of condemnation. So that's the important thing to reframe. If you can't reframe that, this is going to be a heavy trip. We're hoping to offer you a container here where we can all accept our not self as an ally trying to keep us safe, right? Because what could be safer, it thinks, than fitting in, right? Than towing the line, than following the tried and true path. By doing what people seem to do for love, what people seem to do for satisfaction and success. We're not possessed by some evil entity trying to undermine us. No, we're dealing with impersonal machinery programmed to keep us safe. And we now get to watch that program, right? We don't get to just change the behavior, but you can watch it and you can experience it in your body. And in that watching, in that embodied awareness, we're developing a conscious relationship with the not self. And that creates the foundation for transformation, for realignment. Some people also tell me they just don't like the term not self. But it's not bad self, right? We all have a not self, and engaging with it is simply part of the awareness process. The not self analysis could just as well be called the psychological analysis of your design, with its aim being to show the client how their mind interferes and what its unique pattern of interference is, and how that social conditioning has shown up in our unconscious behaviors. So, in my experience, a not self reading has proven to be a very powerful way to help people take human design seriously. It paints a vivid and familiar picture of the pain in our lives, right? And it gives some understanding and forgiveness in that, the potential for a reframe, the potential to see it impersonally, the potential to see it mechanically. So please understand, we can either have a conscious relationship with our not self or an unconscious one. I mean, isn't that the famous Carl Jung quote? That which you don't see controls you from the unconscious. So take your pick. Which path do you think will be more empowering? Hiding from the truth or facing it? Not facing it in some sort of forceful way, not in some seven-centered heroic way. I'm going to be brave, this is the right thing to do. It's just about finding the edge of your capacity to be honest with yourself and to then grow that capacity to be honest with yourself. This is something Teresa and I talk about a lot, just how very few people have capacity for radical honesty. That's such a marker for where you're at is can you be honest with how you're showing up, what you're doing, without turning it into a blame story, but just saying, yeah, that happened, that I do that. That's the new edge. So Ross says, when I meet someone for a reading, I meet their not self. I meet their mind, and people just want to be a better version of their not self. To get people to see that their mind is untrustworthy and that they need to question the legitimacy of this quote unquote better version of their self that they aspire to be, that they think they want. Well, that's quite a task for us as analysts, right? And in truth, as long as a reading provides a clear and accurate message, there's no one way to do it. But the most important thing is the transmission, to touch the person deeply enough that they may give living their design a try. So the not self is incarnate, which is why it's a 7-year cellular deconditioning process. So it should become obvious that the not self exists in the design elements we legitimately have for that reason. And by that, what I mean is the not self conditioning, as it accrues, it influences how your actual design elements express. Remember, we're not deconditioning the mind. We're changing our relationship with it. We're putting it in its proper role in the back seat. What we're deconditioning is the body, right? And as your body does change and decondition, the mental content does, because the body is the platform for consciousness. Change the body, you will change the mind. You can't start from the premise of saying, I don't like my thoughts. You start from the premise of changing the brain to change the mind, right? The body is really where this experiment happens. It's really the battleground, if you will. And think about it. The fact that Ra talks about a 7-year deconditioning, cellular deconditioning process shows that Ra and this transmission of knowledge implicitly acknowledges the reality and the implications of trauma. Whether he uses the term or not is irrelevant. The reality of our situation, the stuckness of matter, is acknowledged, right? Once things get into matter, they take a long time to expunge, right? To change. So trauma is yet another proof point of no choice. It's a proof point of the ineptitude of our mind to stop the trauma loop. You can't reason with your trauma. You can't outsmart it. Well, that's humbling, isn't it? Doesn't that really frame things? Right? We can't just transcend the limitations of our form and the history imprinted in our cells and the implication this has on our present life. So we're watching the mind. We're learning to watch the mind. And by watching the mind, rather than blindly following its dictates, we learn to prevent or at least limit further unconscious conditioning. And by the way, of course, after the first 7 years, the deconditioning continues. But it is different. The first 7 years is mostly about letting go. It's mostly about shedding what you're not. It's that next cycle that is mostly stepping into who you really are in surprising and differentiated ways. Now, I can't speak to the third cycle because I haven't got there yet. I'm only 1.5 cycles in. I'm 11 plus years in. Now, the other thing I want to say about the human design community is all awareness paths and their surrounding communities are prone to bypassing and then creating social agreements to reinforce the bypassing, right? Part of what we do with each other is we create unconscious, implicit agreements to defend our wounding, to hide from our wounding, right? And all such communities are ruled or heavily influenced by Neptune, right? Which on the exalted side can lead to nine-centeredness, spiritual awakening, unconditional love. But on the shadow side, it's about escapism and illusions, right? So what you find in fields like this, as anyone who's been around the block once or twice knows, is you find the most sane and the least sane people, the most grounded, right? And the least grounded, side by side. You have to be careful, right? There's a book that just came out about human design being a cult. Well, if you hold it the way that the author held it, it's culty. That's not my experience, right? So there's a lot of illusions and misunderstandings kind of baked into all of these awareness paths, and you have to kind of find your place in it where it's truly healthy and empowering and your feet are on the ground. So over a lifetime of identification with conditioning, right? Being misled to trust our mind rather than our body, the body adapts to unnatural behaviors, right? The body becomes conditioned, right? And then in terms of the human design chart, meaning our definition, our life force becomes distorted in its expression. And that's why we can't assume that the design elements we have are somehow magically free of any problem. No, they've become conditioned, right? And like some plant that has to grow at a strange, unnatural angle to reach the sun, this is what happens to each of us. So people in the experiment often say things like, my body did it, therefore it's correct. Not so fast, right? The body holds on to the past. Trauma prevents us from being present. And it can be difficult at times to sort out what's a trauma response and what's your inner authority. This will be an ongoing question throughout the entire course. Right? The body's fundamentally trying to keep you safe and alive as best as it can. But that survival agenda can prevent us from living our purpose. So we want to find a way to honor what the body is doing while also seeing how some of its tactics are no longer needed, right? And finding healthier behaviors which don't undermine our capacity for presence and for our purpose. So finally, I'll say that, the not self formula or the not self, it's easy to map because it's a formula. It's homogeneous by nature, right? That's what gives it its predictability. When we get later in this semester, we're going to start practicing. And one aspect of your practice is to lean into your common assumptions about how things play out, because that's the nature of the not self. So identity always emerges out of relationship. I just want you to sit with that for a second. Identity always emerges out of relationship. It emerges out of a relationship between different parts of ourself, right? And identity emerges out of a relationship between different people. We could say that our sense of self, our identity, our personality, our awareness of our personality emerges out of our capacity for self-reflective consciousness. That means we're built on this internal dialogue, right, within ourselves. That identity is emerging out of the relationship between the witness and the mind. Our self reflected consciousness produces a sense of self that we perceive as separate from the other and the environment and in control of its destiny. All right, this goes back to the monopole holds us together in the illusion of our separateness, right? In the illusion of our separateness. So our inner monologue fluctuates, right, from our bodily chemistry and the neutrino stream. And the personality is subject to mental interference, right? Because the nature of these gates occupy your subjective awareness, and the mind tries to do something with them, right? And it's this identification with the mental stories that perpetuates the conditioning and distorts the expression of our nature. Again, the design is not immune from problems. Life force itself can be part of the not self formula because we've identified with the wrong conditioning and taken on not self behaviors. So blindly trusting the body also perpetuates the conditioning because the history of mental conditioning and trauma in our cells, it's now in your unconscious behavior. Consequently, the life force becomes distorted. So Ra talks about different frequency expressions of each channel. Well, he didn't really talk about it publicly, but he talked about it with the students that I trained from. This was not a Richard Rudd innovation to look at higher levels, but Richard Rudd has his own interpretation, his own language that he put to things. But Ra understood that there's different, expressions, right? There's sort of a whole bandwidth, and there's different ways that you can express the life force across that. For example, Ra said the channel of struggle would be the channel of enlightenment in the true self. So it's important to consider what's the nature of that channel in its essence and how is it designed to function when that person is surrendered? What sort of problems will a person get into with that channel when they're trying to control life in order to survive, in order to get ahead, in order to get power? So it's important to consider how the channel is designed to function at its mechanical essence. How does it function when the person is surrendered? What sorts of problems will they get into when they're trying to control things? I remember I had an interesting conversation with a reflector years ago, and she had a question about how do you use your channels? She didn't know, well, how do you use them? And it's a perfectly sensible question for someone without definition. But the thing is, you don't use your channels. They use you, right? You being the identified personality. But you might get in their way, so to speak, with mental identification, or you can't express them in their clearest frequency because of years of conditioning. So things change not with effort or intention, right? That's the old model, right? But with relaxation and surrender and awareness. Pushing for things to change screws them up more. You can see that a dozen times a day, every single day on the news. People trying to bring about a change, perhaps from a moral premise that sounds really lovely, but they're doing it forcefully, and it creates more problems than they're solving. So one of the key dilemmas here, because right, everything's upside down, backwards in this world. And rightness, unfortunately, hasn't really had a roadmap for how to live its nature. Right. So you can see here some features of rightness and leftness. We live in a left-centric world that is rapidly changing toward rightness. There's so much evidence of that now. Right? People just can't hack it anymore. They just can't focus. They just can't plan. They just can't operate strategically. It's just not working, right? Planning itself is going away, right? As we move into the new era. And one reason it's going away is the predominance of rightness and because life has now become so complicated. Who can plan for anything? It's too much complexity, too many variables. But what I want to point out here is living in this left centric world from our left oriented ancestors, it's the right centric beings who often suffer the most, right? Being asked to memorize and not knowing what they've retained, being asked to focus, to pay attention, be strategic, set goals, make things happen. Why can't you use your mind reliably on command? Well, all that can take a huge toll on a person's psychological and physical well-being, right? When that receptive mind tries to be strategic, when that passive brain tries to be active, boy, don't I know that one. I feel it. If I do too much intellectual work in a day, my brain, my right brain, feels strained like a muscle and it starts spinning out. If my balance of physical activity and intellectual exertion in every day is off, I can't sleep, right? Overworking that right brain, it spins out. It's difficult to get it to calm down and be passive again. Or we're the observer trying to be observed. Or we have a peripheral view that's trying to be focused. So this is why we're not imposing the same set of standards and expectations on both the left and right-minded beings in the class, right? That would just be unjust and unfair. So when we talk about seven-centeredness, what are we talking about? Well, here's a list of actions that I see as seven-centered. And listen, I know you might say, well, competes, weren't some people designed to be? Yeah, but the energy behind it's different, right? Most people are competing from a not-self place. But just take a look and see which ones resonate with you or which ones maybe surprise you. You can notice that they're all an expression at the deepest level, fundamentally, of a distrust in life. They're all an expression of a lack of surrender. And that distrust then inevitably leads to a whole host of psychological compensations and typically power dynamics on some level, making yourself bigger than others, making yourself smaller than others, thinking you need to scheme and strategize and manipulate and control the outcome because you think you know what you need and you think you know what you're supposed to be. So what's interesting to me is the concept of surrender, right? This concept that we think of as this kind of highfalutin, in other words, kind of, elevated, lofty, enigmatic concept most people don't think is very practical. That's for strange, fringe, mystical people. That's not anything that everyday people need to be concerned with. But human design shows that life actually only works from a place of surrender. Full stop. It only works from a place of surrender. We can only be sane and healthy and functioning optimally and fulfilling our purpose when surrender, right? It is the prerequisite to everything else. The psychological dimension is sticky. The more we wrestle with life at the psychological level, the more we sink further into the illusion. That's why seven-centered moral codes don't connect us with ourselves or reality itself more. No, they do the opposite. They become obscuring filters. They become a filter between us and others, between us and life, us and whatever is in front of us in the present moment. So how do we, quote unquote, liberate awareness. I don't have any evidence to believe there's such a thing as a final liberation. No lasting state of enlightenment for anyone I've ever met, and I've definitely met some very acclaimed spiritual teachers and gotten to know them behind the scenes. But there are degrees of liberation, if we can use that word responsibly. And for me, it's not about becoming enlightened. It's just about living an honest life, a life based on a conscious relationship with myself and others. That's what we're offering here at the New School. Awareness, tools to live an honest and healthy life, period. For us, that's everything. For us, that's enough. We gain distance from the mind by practicing being in touch with and informed by energy as we sensationally experience it in our body, right? Both our own energy relative to our definition and others relative to our openness, right? It's that somatic work that releases stuck survival energy and liberates that intelligence. This is what Ra is pointing at here with this quote. Don't struggle with your mind, struggle with your body, struggle with your energy. So here's a list of actions that I associate with nine-centeredness. And that's what we're ultimately guiding people to as analysts. Not just providing information, ChatGPT can do that, but providing a transmission. Right? Nine-centered living, nine-centered communing, right, is the fruit of the experiment. It's about communing. Ra one time defined nine-centeredness as, and I love this, it's so profound and simple, it totally makes the point. Communication without lying. So take a look at the list, see which ones call to you. The truth is that when you have a foothold in one, it can become an anchor to open up a relationship with others. You know, everything in us is all connected, right? So a shift in one area creates shifts in other areas of life. So the person who is my most significant mentor for a number of years, I haven't worked with her in several years, but for quite a number of years, Kamud Kabir, one of Ra's longtime students since the late 90s, she told me that the foundation reading she got from Ra would not have passed the analyst training standards of today. Couple things to say about that. Number one, Ra's core skill here was not being an analyst or a teacher. He's a messenger, right? I'm a teacher. I'm not a messenger. He's a messenger. He's not a teacher. There's a difference. There's a difference, right? He's bringing something completely new onto the planet, but it's largely disorganized and messy, and it's not really put in a, pedagogical format. We all know that. Right? And it was really a few of his first generation students that really took the analysis further. But the important takeaway from me sharing this experience that Kamud had is really that what inspired her to get into the experiment was less about the information and more about the transmission from Ra, right? She could feel the truth of his words. So if you're living this, people will feel it. This is a calling, not a job. It isn't like, do I want to be a doctor, a lawyer, or a human design analyst? No, like you have to be called into this. Like this has to be something that, is coming from a soul level, right? That's the important thing. If you're living it, people will feel it. We need to become more than intellectual analysts. We need to do more then memorize keynotes and learn how to string them together. Yes, we need to learn how to do that, but no, that's not all there is to this, right? It's by returning to our true nature that we empower, right, and inspire others to do the same. Finally, I just want to say something about surrender that hopefully you took note of in the bonus class that you watched earlier this week, which is simply to just reiterate, it's not passive. It's not about living on the couch. It's what I don't like about Mary Ann's book. She's just like wallowing away on the bed. Oh, I'm just spending all day on the bed. I'm waiting. I'm like, not really. No. So surrender, you can be surrendered and live a very active life, right? It doesn't look like something specifically. It's not what you're doing, it's how you're doing it. You can't look from the camera lens and tell. It's where you're living from. It's a life orientation, right? But many people just get caught up in trying to live out this mental concept of what they imagine it must be to be surrendered. And it starts to make your life look weird. And it's disempowering, right? It distorts your life. It's conforming to an artificial limitation. This is why I said human design can bring you more into your mind or your body. That's the necessity, right, of what it is in this binary world. Can go both ways. So this can be conforming to some artificial imagined limitation rather than surrendering to our natural limitation, which is what the experiment is really about. Any questions or comments about the scope of the not self before we continue? I know this is dense. I mean, there's a lot, depending on your prior experience to reflect on here.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Uh, so
Trinity, you're very quiet. I
regarding what,
noticed in the recording from yesterday too. Is there anything you can do to?
sorry about that. Let me see.
Yeah, no
Is
worries.
that better?
That is better. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Hi, James. So, regarding what you just said, would your view of living surrendered, if it's not about what we do, but it's about how we do it, would we want to just stay active and the key being staying in that observer perspective and just
You're
always seeing
making
what's happening?
you're giving yourself a task. You're giving yourself a plan.
Okay.
Yeah. Surrender is the thing that happens when you take your hands off the wheel and you let go of all the plans, let go of all the schemes.
Okay.
It's already there. It's your nature is being, your nature is surrendered. It's just that we're not settled there. Every time we try to be surrendered, we're no longer surrendered, right?
Okay. So when I am struggling to make a decision, for example,
Mm-hmm.
there and there is this fear, for me at least, the way it shows up, it's like I've had too much commitment in my life. Like what I see my not self do a lot in the past is I will say yes to a lot of things, right? I'm a generator. And so I have learned a lot from that and I have stopped saying yes, but sometimes it has this opposite effect of don't say yes to anything because you don't want to be in that spot again. So in terms of making a decision,
Can I pause you? Because I have the answer. So like, and I want to, I
okay,
just, the answer is that you have to open up capacity to honor your boundaries and say no, right? That's the way that you beat this. You cut it off at the root, at the bodily level. You can never have some sort of mental heuristic which can keep you out of this trouble. You can watch the pattern. Oh, I see that I do this, and I see that I have beliefs around thinking that I need to do this, right? But you have to go down to the soil, to your body, and develop capacity to then be sensitive enough to say, my boundaries are being violated here. I'm uncomfortable. That tells me this is a no. See, everything we're
Right.
doing is a flip from the seven centered. The seven centered model is top down. It's we're going to teach you some principles and you're going to do your best to strive and embody them. That's the Saturnian way. That's why the old
Mhm.
spiritual paths were strict and there's discipline and they're militant and we walk the fine line and there's harsh punishments if we don't do it right. The Uranian way, right, is beyond that, right? And that's bottom up. Bottom up means we develop bodily capacity and bodily sensitivity, bodily intelligence to know the difference between what's what. The whole human design community is wrapped up in your question, and they don't have an answer that is whoever that answer is not circulating in the public discourse. Everyone's
Mhm.
trying to police themselves and each other
Mhm.
through a code of understanding, and that's why the human design field has, I think, a low energy from my touch cognition discernment because it's heavy and it's clunky and it's on the wrong side of the binary that I just mentioned. It's bringing people more in their mind versus more in their body. That's why
Yeah.
this thing that we're bringing in with Teresa is the thing that changes everything. And it's not just that, but it's also that I've learned over years of working with people how to articulate connecting with your soma, connecting with your body versus some more vague direction that is popular in the field, right? Because your inner
Mhm.
authority is somatic, right? And I know
Yeah.
there's nuances when we get to lunar and we get to mental, but we'll unpack those distinctions then. But does it make sense what I'm saying? Like you're looking for,
Yeah.
if only I knew the thing, then I
Yeah.
could, yeah.
I think I'm gonna stay. I think you said this. I'm gonna stay with don't try to define surrender with your mind.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a good place to
All right.
start.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Great
Okay.
question. Really important question. Mark, Mark.
Hi guys. So yeah, just you mentioned the word enlightenment in a nine-centered context, and I sort of I always felt like enlightenment was a seven-centered term, really, from a sort of an ideal of what it was to be in the seven-centered sort of world, and
It is.
enlightenment was the goal. So really want to sort of understand how not to feel like enlightenment has any kind of meaning anymore in our lives, because I still feel that people think that enlightenment, or maybe, well, I know for instance, for myself, maybe before human design, the idea of being enlightened was such a kind of alluring thing to have. But now I see it like as a seven-centered focus. So, but it wasn't on the list because it's a bit of an all-encompassing word of the promise of seven-centeredness. So I don't know
I
if that's
I
really a
agree.
question that's
I
there.
I I agree with you, Mark. I hope I didn't say anything that confused that point. My point is that I don't
No.
believe in enlightenment. I'm not selling enlightenment. I don't trust people that sell enlightenment, and I agree that it's a Saturnian aspiration. That's why what
Mm,
our model is honesty. It's about developing capacity to fully meet your experience in the present moment, right? To be honest with yourself, right? And then the next level of that is to take honest accountability for how you show up
mhm,
without that sneaky little seven-centered conditioned um, inclination to frame your accountability in shame or judgment or guilt. You see, that slips in really easily because we do need to be accountable. Yes, I showed up, that happened. And can we take that accountability without there being a heavy trip around it? That's the nine centered realization, right? Whereas the seven centered, when you go to these kind of, coaching seminars and programs, it's this real heavy handed trip around. You got to live up to your word. And if you don't, there's like a heaviness around all of it. But the nuance is what if we take responsibility and accountability, but there is no such heavy trip that we're bringing to it, right? But I just want to reiterate, yeah, I hopefully I did not misconstrue the point, but I'm totally on the same page. The era of chasing enlightenment, I think, is it's over. That was for the seven-centered ancestors. Yeah. Okay, there's something in the chat. Yeah, Salongo said, what's coming up for me is surrendered is not efforting. I love that. Yeah, thank you. Okay, let's move on in the interest of time. There's always other opportunities to ask questions. So correctness is relative to your location and state of being, right? So what your body chooses is relative to your place and the condition of your body, right? There's no absolute correctness in a sense. There's no capacity for correctness that magically transcends the history recorded in your cells and imprinted on your nervous system. You're only as aware, you're only as aware as your nervous system is regulated and has capacity to be challenged, right? To appropriately become dysregulated when necessary, to take on that healthy stress and adapt. Right. So just to underscore what Tegan and Teresa are already talking about, it's not about being calm all the time, right? It's really about resilience to move through all these different scenarios and then come back to your center, right? But you're only as correct as you can be given your life experience and trauma history, right? So what's correct for you today may not be correct tomorrow. And remember, we're Uranian beings, right? Seven-centered beings were Saturnian. Hence, again, that fact that seven-centered spirituality is strict, disciplined, it's punishing, right? All of those Saturnian qualities. We're not wired that way anymore, right? Uranus is called the sidetrack on the personality side. And what that says to me is that off track is still ultimately on the right track, right? We're always either aligned, fulfilling our purpose, or we're having the perfect experience that can bring us back into alignment to fulfill our purpose, right? We're getting knocked back on the right path by having the perfect challenge, but it's all ultimately our path. So I love this quote. It's a rare quote that I don't hear people talk about much, but no choice doesn't mean no chance, right? So be careful about turning no choice into fatalism, right? That doesn't empower anybody, right? Don't limit people's potential, right? Just direct them to the content of their mind and to their true nature. Let them discover no choice in their own way, in their own timing, if they're meant to do so. A nuance here, which I feel is important, is to distinguish that there is a subjective experience of a chooser that, in my experience, never completely goes away. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not there, right? So sometimes I am just doing something in a flow and there's no sense of anything in me that made that choice. Sometimes there is a sense of me saying, okay, James, don't choose that mental story. Surrender to your inner authority, right? Now, without the benefit of design mechanics, right? Ross says design mechanics they've been hidden, right? They've been hidden throughout history. Without understanding design, we don't realize that the chooser is an illusion that's really at the mercy of underlying unconscious mechanics, at the mercy of our body's chemistry, right? But again, you can have that experience of yourself choosing your inner authority. And that's not a subjective experience that I think is important to try to take away from someone. I think it's quite natural. I think it deserves to be there, but to also have the understanding that there's, what is it that you're really consciously engaging with there? And to remember it is platformed by the underlying mechanics. So in our traumatized world, human design pairs well with modalities which release trauma, but don't insidiously empower the mind, right? Because there's a lot of seven-centered healing arts fields, sciences out there that are still stuck in the seven-centered assumptions, you know? But at the same time, some people go too far in this field and they condemn the entire field of psychology as seven-centered. Well, that's just not true. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Or they make the same mistake with astrology or healing modalities such as acupuncture. Listen, it's all about how you use these things. They're not inherently problematic, right? By some means, we need to work with the body and the nervous system, right? And with any approach, the conversation with the practitioner is really just a means to elicit responses from the body that become important clues about where the client is stuck in a trauma loop, right? So while observing our thought stream rather than acting it out limits and prevents the continued reinforcement of our not self, it in and of itself is not enough. If you can just become aware of something and never do it again, your body was already beyond it, right? But just this premise of follow strategy and authority is not that different from old religious principles, right? Oh, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that, and it's going to change my life. It's deeper than that, right? And that gets back to my answer to Trini a moment ago. What are we really doing here? What's the real deconditioning work? And again, some form of trauma release is often indicated to reset our nervous system and enable a greater capacity to live in the body and recognize our inner authority. You don't have to be the one to offer that service. That's not the premise of this course. You don't have to do anything with somatics. I'm just simply helping you understand where you're at in the healing process. If you're an analyst and you just want to be an analyst, don't close doors to what the client otherwise needs. Or you might be the type of person who does want to synthesize different modalities. And I think that's very powerful, and we highly encourage it. You just want to be careful that you're only bringing in modalities that don't insidiously give power to the mind. Okay? That's the important distinction. So for me, this path, again, is not about chasing a glamorized notion of awakening, right? As I said, it's about living an honest life. It's about finding safety and comfort and reliability within the body, acknowledging our role in things, both consciously and unconsciously, however, without blaming or shaming ourselves. What does accountability mean without the heavy trip that we tend to bring around it? Because are we meant to get rid of the concept of accountability altogether? I don't think so, but we have to reframe how we work with it. We need to see both ourselves and other people's actions as impersonal, and meeting self and other with acceptance, which is really the only true foundation of relationship. Right? We can rewire the trauma responses and see through the predictable, formulaic, banal, not self stories that our mind comes up with. But we never entirely get rid of our not self. We change our relationship with it, which is all the difference in the world. And it will change in its expressions. It will get trickier and more subtle. I had a teacher one time say the mind is the best lawyer in town. Exactly. Your not self is very cunning, very crafty, very persuasive. It's got all the reasons in the world, right? But as we know, our truth that we're living from is not based on a reason. It transcends reason. So any questions or comments? We're going to use the remainder of class to talk briefly about the aura types, kind of a quick overview of some of the core not self themes, and we'll be going deeper into those topics throughout the remainder of the semester. Anything coming up? Okay. So what does waiting really mean? I mean, is it the same waiting that we do at the bank or at the grocery store? Right? What does it mean? Well, you can wait in an engaged and embodied way or a dead dull way from transference. The truth of the matter is, it's really whenever we say that we're waiting, well, we went into our mind, didn't we? It's really only the relationship between the passenger, you know, waiting for a change, right? It's the relationship between the passenger and the vehicle. That's where the waiting occurs. It's the mind that's waiting. We're here just to be without any concern, without any agenda. So when we're consciously waiting, it means that we went into our mind, and that's okay. It's an important redirect. It's a conscious pause. It's an opportunity to maybe break the pattern. But as I just said, if you can break the pattern merely by watching it, your body is already beyond it. When you can't break the pattern by watching it, that means there's trauma work to do. It's an easy distinction. I can get over that quickly by watching it. Your body's already pretty much over that. I can't. There's something here to investigate at the somatic level, right? But this waiting is really a seven-centered moral injunction, just like thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. It's another one of these, right? It can only go so far, right? And it works to a point, right? So waiting is not being. Waiting is a redirect back to being, right? It's a redirect back to being. But what I want to bring to your attention here is the importance of really getting increasingly embodied, which means much more than just following strategy and authority, but allowing your body to inform everything you're doing throughout the day. Like, when are you taking one too many bites of food, even? Or resisting the urge to go to sleep when your body is tired? Or pushing too hard at work when your body is saying no? There's so much information that we're so cut off from. And what Teresa is doing is giving you the tools and the practices to not just follow strategy and authority, which is one way of honoring your body, but bringing bodily awareness gradually into every moment, right? Because we're all so profoundly cut off. I mean, this is one of the things one of my trauma therapist teachers answered this question from a student who said, why is the world so traumatized? Why is this like such an important topic right now? And his answer, which I think was a good one, was that we've just gotten so out of touch from our body and so out of touch with the natural things that we would do to process that energy, to move through an activation cycle. We're just so caught off. All those things that we would naturally do that were second nature to us at one point in human history. Well, we don't, you know, we're out of touch with that now. Right. So we're slowly learning to really come back into the body and trust what it's indicating moment by moment. And the only way to really guide people in many ways with human design is to help them understand the distinction between the mind and the body. I'll give those of you who are a little bit more advanced a little nugget of what I mean. What do you do with a 1-3 profile that has fourth color need motivation and transfers to fear? If you don't understand, don't worry about this. This will be a topic later. If you do understand, that's a pretty interesting question, because at the profile level, they're meant to investigate and go deep and understand things so they feel more secure. But at the color level, they're transferring to fear, which also looks like investigation. What's the distinction? The distinction is they have to see that, oh, when I transfer to fear, I become hyper aroused. I become panicked and anxious in my investigations. That's the tell. That's the indication that I'm no longer merely investigating as I am designed to at the profile level. I am now out of alignment. I am now up in my head and I'm panicked about what I think I need to know. If you don't understand the somatic distinction, how in the world do you help that client navigate the difference? So waiting, there's a concept called transference. If you're not familiar yet, it's fine. You're going to learn about it. It's a big trap to be waiting from transference, to be basically in your head so much. For me, I have guilt motivation. I transfer to hope, which means I'm not really fixing the things that might be correct for me to fix. I'm letting them fester and get worse. right? I think a lot of people are doing this, waiting from transference. So, really important thing, it's going to come up in a later class. We're going to go really deep into transference. You're going to know all about it. But when I saw this, it was truly a revelation. People get really triggered when I bring this up, actually. It touches a nerve. And the thing is that waiting itself can also be a reinforcement of certain types of trauma. For example, with myself, I had a trauma related to my personality Uranus, which is in gate 43, which carries a fear of rejection, right? My individual thinking, right? Individual gate. Will it be rejected? Will I be rejected? And so I wasn't putting myself out there in all of my uniqueness. And then human design comes along and says, no need to do anything, just wait. And it was the perfect thing for my not self to hear, to continue to hide. It was the permission slip to continue to hide, to continue to hold myself back. So these are the types of knots that you're all facing and your clients are all facing that we need to learn how to help them navigate with nuance, with a nuanced understanding of the system, and with the embodiment component. So the experiment is really about watching our inner authority make decisions, right? Decision watching, not decision making. And again, awareness is alchemical, and witnessing life as the passenger transforms life, right? Life reflects what you are. That's the quantum truth. You know, there is truth to things like the law of attraction, but not the way most people think about it. Because it's not about mentally reprogramming yourself to attract what your mind thinks it wants, right? The last thing we should want is what our mind thinks it wants. It might be onto something. It might be craving. You might realize consciously that you're craving connection. You see? And that's good to take stock of, but don't think you know what that looks like and how to get it, right? Your mind's going to come up with a conditioned picture of what it thinks that means. But that's not necessarily the type of connection that's in store for you on your path that your body really needs, right? So if you look at those mental stories, there's often a seed, there's a kernel of something true there. Oh, okay. What is this really about? Ah, I'm craving human connection. Okay, fair, right? But the mind schemes to get it, and its pictures of what it should look like aren't serving us. The true law of attraction is more like this. You did some deep work. And now, via that process that you've been through, you're fundamentally in a different place within yourself. You're fundamentally in a different place within yourself. And then guess what? Naturally, people will respond to you differently. Why? Because you're putting a different frequency in the field. But again, this is not about getting what your mind wants. It's about working through something. And then as your consciousness shifts, as your frequency shifts, you see how life appears different on the other side, right? When we change, life changes. The very room in front of us changes. The situation and how we interpret it in front of us changes. And our interactions with others occur differently. Right? For example, maybe you've been in a state of grief about a loss of a relationship. So when you meet people, you might be interested in romantically. They are apprehensive about pursuing it because they sense your lack of availability. Even if this is not a conscious choice for them, they just sense something. Then one day, you really release a lot of grief. And then suddenly, that other person feels something different. Even if they don't know why, and they don't know what, they can't quite put their finger on it. And then a relationship becomes a possibility. The way the experiment works is that awareness of mechanics brings the conditions for alignment, slowly but surely. And a choice itself is somehow more powerful when it's observed. Right? But we need to see that thinking and seeing are very different things. We all think that we see, but we're mainly seeing or thinking. You got that? We all think that we're seeing, we're mainly seeing or thinking. All of our beliefs are just wrapped up in the raw physical phenomena around us, right? It goes back to the basic conditioning. When you look at a table, you see a concept called a table, and you might say, no, I see a table. No, but your mind has thoughts hovering around, right? A table's a mundane example, but when you see, I don't know, the type of person that's transgressed you in the past, you're not seeing this person who you've never met before with fresh eyes, with a clean slate. You're seeing the associations of how they remind you of someone that transgressed you in the past. Right. So believing we need to get we need to take stock. This is another reason why the importance of the nuts up. We need to take stock of all of our assumptions and beliefs that reinforce our own echo chamber and cut us off from true perception. And if we're cut off from true perception, we're not thinking clearly, and we're also not relating. So again, we want to learn to distinguish between the thought stream and mechanics, seeing those mechanics, right? And then developing the capacity to live what is our birthright, right? But it's really the watching, the embodied watching that is the marriage, the yoga, right? The alchemy that really aligns our life to the correct trajectory.